Okay, well, we're at the last book for this course on aesthetics. Um, that book, of course, is Essays on the Nature of Art by Elliot Deutsch. What I want to do today is say a little something about what it is that Deutsch is trying to do in the first section of this work regarding the nature of art, the interpretation of whether art is imitation, whether art is expression, and of course the aesthetic attitude one takes towards art. And I want to talk about this and sort of go through the way in which Deutsch uses all this to try to talk in a rather generalized way about what the nature of art is overall. Now, the reason I picked this book to begin with is really there's a few reasons. First of all, this is one of the only works that we're going to look at where we actually get a sense of a philosopher's actual theory of art. We've certainly seen a sense of different philosophers' theories of art. We saw that with the Beardsley book, with Plato and with Kant and with Nietzsche and Aristotle and all these people. Uh, we saw all that at work with them, but you didn't actually get the primary text there. What you saw was sort of a summary of the ideas. You didn't see the ideas actually being worked out. That would have been tough because I got these big giant pieces. But you are seeing that worked out with Deutsch. He's quite succinct in what he's doing. That's as far as a theory of art goes, it's almost an epigram, really. I mean, he really condenses it very sharply in what he's doing with this. So there's that. Another thing that's important is that as much as this is a theory of art, Deutsch is not simply a philosopher of art or an aesthetician. I mean, he's a philosopher generally, but he's a philosopher for whom the philosophy of art is at the center of his philosophy. I've heard him say before that if you want to understand the way in which he thinks about the nature of science or the nature of language or the nature of wisdom, really having an understanding of how one understands the senses and the aesthetic, and in particular art, is pretty central to understanding these things. It's not to say that everything else is based off of them, but it's to say that it's integral to it. So I wanted us to have not just a systematic view of a theory of art generally. I wanted to have a theory of art that talked about art in relation to all sorts of other things that people know, and Deutsch fits the bill with that. And there's actually one more thing too about Deutsch that I like quite a bit. Deutsch is he is a comparative philosopher. That is to say, he looks at philosophy within a lot of different cultures. He's a specialist, amongst other things, in classical South Asian philosophy. He knows a lot about Asian thought, Chinese thought. He's interested in Islamic thought. And he takes all of that and tries to look cross-culturally, maybe trans-culturally might even be a better word, at how it is that these human experiences within culture and through culture give rise to the possibilities of art. That's what he's trying to do. So I thought that would be good too, to be able to get this sense of not just a theory of art, and not just a theory of art that pervades through philosophy, but a theory of art that pervades through philosophy and proceeds with culture as well. So that's what we're aiming at. All right. Well, in looking at the actual work itself, I wanted to talk about section 1 here, and the beginning of Deutsch's theory of art. He asks a question that really we've been asking throughout this entire course and trying to find some responses to, namely, what is art? And one of the things he points out with this is that, as you've no doubt noticed, this is a pretty difficult question to answer. But it's a difficult question to answer, according to Deutsch, not just because there's all these variations within people's opinions or people's senses or what they'd like art to do. It has to do with the nature of the way that art exists, the way in which it is in the world. For Deutsch, art is set within a culture and is expressing ideas from or through this context. Art is I don't think he puts it this way, but it's a radically cultural phenomenon. That is to say, it is something that exists in the roots and the fabric of humans culturalizing. I don't even want to call culture a thing so much as an activity, a process, a basic way of us being what we are. Well, art is set within this. It's set within us enculturating ourselves and our world and those things around us. It's a basic dimension, almost an axiom of that, if you like. And because of that, because it's run so deep in culture, when we try to ask, well, what is art? You get a problem. And the problem is this: art shapes the terms by which it attempts to evaluate itself, as well as the evaluation by others. So that when you try to, say, discuss, well, can't we just look at a collection of art, go to a museum, see all these different things that different people have called art, put them together and say, okay, that's art. Well, I suppose perhaps you can do that, but the problem is that that itself is taking all the stuff that's called art and putting it into another cultural context. We could talk about the idea of the artist as the world creator, something that's gone on in a lot of the conversations we've had. This is and as you've come to see, this is a very deep idea within the Romantic movement in the late 18th and early 19th century philosophy, right? It's a central feature of it. Well, that's fine, and the idea that the artist is a creator or expresser of the world, a maker of these new ways of being, that works well in our modern view because we're post-romantic people. But it doesn't work, for instance, in the medieval view. It doesn't really work all that well within a lot of other cultural views, say within a lot of indigenous populations. So we have a situation in which any attempt to understand art outside of the cultural context that it arises from is in some sense empty and abstract. To know art, to understand art, is to participate in the setting of the art. It's to come to it. I think probably that I know that all sounds rather highfalutin, but to my way of thinking, one of the best ways of doing that, of thinking about that really, is to think about it in terms of getting to know another person. If I want to get to know someone, I don't decide who they are going to be, what their categories are, make a checklist and go do that. I mean, maybe you do that on eharmony.com or something, but even then it doesn't really work. You want to get to know somebody, you got to really go and know them. You got to talk to them. You got to empathize with them. You got to try to relate to them. You got to share things with them. You got to go to them as persons in their physical and spiritual being and come to know them as they are and let them come to know you as they are. Well, what we're going to see with art is basically the same thing has to happen because you're dealing with something that has not an identical dynamic, but an analogous dynamic, a way in which what makes art what it is that there's an integrity, an internal rightness to it that is art, that's set within this culture. And to understand it, to participate it, to have the aesthetic attitude towards it, you have to go to it that way. Art makes claims about the way things are. This is what Deutsch says. And he doesn't just mean the way things are, the way, I don't know, a book report tells you the way things are, or something like that in the news. He means it makes claims about the way things are and that it is a way of being, right? It's a way of holding and being present in terms of values. So that when you try to talk about what the nature of art is, it's as difficult as basically trying to say what the nature of reality is. And you can't really define it. What you can do is engage it, participate in it, use it, evoke it, understand it in that regard. But you can't just limit it to a definition and leave it at that. This is what happens with attempts to deal with art. And I suppose it's because of this, because of the depth and the intricacy of what art is, how much it's set within that cultural milieu, if you like, that you give so many wide variety of interpretations as to what art is. That it's family resemblance of things, or the anything goes that Ziff talked about in the last book, or the institutional museums calling them a certain thing, or the essentialism, all these different things, right? Even something that is make-believe, the essay that was written in the last book, that art is a way of treating things in a certain way. All these different interpretations come from the fact that you can't really reduce it to something. So if that's the case, then where do we go from here? Where does Deutsch go from here? Well, Deutsch's approach is to try to deal with this issue from the point of view of some of the classical ways in which this has been approached. He's going to talk about art as interpretation or representation, one of the classical ways to approach it. He's going to talk about art as expression. He's not going to say that it's either one or the other. The great debate is not just settled with no, it's this or that. Instead what he's going to do is he's going to try to talk about the ways in which interpretation is integral to the life of art, or expression is integral to the life of art. And then finally, the aesthetic attitude and how the aesthetic attitude towards art brings the possibility for art to express and represent itself in being what it is. So let me say a little more about that in a moment here, starting with the idea of art as imitation or representation.